And good morning, everybody. We are live. Congratulations. You made it through the week. It is Friday. And if you're new to the chat, my name is Brian Armentrout with the Food Leadership Group. And every Friday at 8 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Mountain, 10 a.m. Eastern, and a sleepy 7 a.m. on Pacific Coast, where Bill is, we get together and talk about all things food safety. And every week it's my pleasure to bring on an expert in the food safety field and have a conversation with them. And if you're new to the chat, one of the things that you'll notice is this is not a presentation. This is not a webinar with a bunch of PowerPoints and things that you go through. This is a open discussion. And what's really fun about this, and we highly encourage, is comments and questions and throwing those in the feed here. And we'll put those in here as things develop out. Steve, good morning. And this is a golden opportunity to talk with someone that I'm sure you see around if you're in the food industry everywhere, and you don't necessarily get a chance to talk to because you may bump into him in a conference and corner him for 5 minutes, and that's about all you get. He's a busy guy. So this is an amazing opportunity. Tim and Cara, good morning, guys. Good to see you. So, of course, I'm with the esteemed Bill Marler of Marler Clark, one of the leading food law firms here in the U.S. So good morning, Bill. How you doing this morning?
I'm good, Brian. Good to see you.
Yeah. So we were just talking about that beautiful background. And I get this sometimes with my background. This is a real background. And I'll like grab something off my desk and people are like, what? But no, I assure you this is a real background. And that's kind of what I was looking at your background as well, too. It's so cool looking. It almost looks like it's one of those generated ones. And the only way you can tell nowadays, right, is if somebody moves and you can get some pixelation or things like that. So that's always interesting.
No, it's I'm sitting at my kitchen counter. So everybody else is still asleep. So
there you go. We'll see a cat come walking across.
Yeah.
Definitely. So one of the things that so I've had you on a couple of times before, and it's always a great conversation. And you're out there kind of tip of the spear in the food industry and really looking at different things. And of course, lots of activity relative to the FDA. They're really been in the hot seat around infant formula and what went down in that field and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And through your activities and food safety news and these type of things, which, by the way, again, thank you for doing that. I love that. I read it every day. And big push that you have out there right now, and you've had a change of heart around this, and I wanted to kind of dive into this a little bit more, is the Food and Drug Administration, right? So it's essentially little f, big D administration. Right. The focus is on the drug side. So I guess maybe to kind of start off here, let's get everybody up to speed on what you've been up to and what's going on with that piece of it.
Sure. Well, I think it's important to know is that a lot of times, when the lawyer shows up, usually something sort of bad happens, and it tends to have a negative connotation, and that is certainly true, and that's part of what I do. When a foodborne illness outbreak happens and I get retained by somebody, and I show up at some manufacturer's doorstep, it's not the most pleasant thing. Mm-hmm. But I've spent a lot of my 30 years now, because it's the 30th anniversary of Jack in the Box outbreak announcement was just a few months ago. And I've spent 30 years of my career not just suing companies, but also trying to figure out the right levers to push to prevent these things from happening. And I give you that sort of background and context because I think it's important to understand that we can accomplish good things. I mean, things do happen. And if you go back to the Jack in the Box outbreak, that was an E. coli 015787 outbreak linked to hamburger. In the 90s, early 2000s, hemolytic uremic syndrome, which is the bad outcome of 0157, was thought of as quote the hamburger disease. And one of the things that happened post Jack in the Box is it was a crisis. It was a crisis for obviously political people. It was a crisis for the industry, crisis for consumers. And what came of that was a fairly relatively simple, if you think about it, a relatively simple change that E. coli 0157 was considered an adulterant. I mean, uh, before that decision was made, meat companies could knowingly ship and sell E. coli contaminated hamburger, and it was up to the consumer to deal with it. And obviously, that's why we had multiple outbreaks. And what happened was, in the 90s, there was a lot of litigation. Took a while for the system to sort of adjust. There were, for those listeners, watchers who, are old enough, back in the 90s, early 2000s, recalls linked to meat were, especially for 0157, were a weekly occurrence, 500,000 pounds, 1 million pounds, 10 million pounds of meat. There were outbreaks, litigation, and really from 1993 to about 2002, 2003, 90% of my law firm revenue was E. coli cases linked to hamburger. That has essentially disappeared, and I wouldn't even say essentially; it has disappeared. And the reason why is that there was really government and industry, coming together, and and making our food supply safer. And I, I tell that story because I think it's sometimes especially when I show up or when I'm at a conference and I tell war stories and how everything's bad and people get sick, I think people fail to remember that we can do things, we can accomplish stuff, big stuff that makes a difference in people's lives and makes a difference not only in making it so there's no more lawyers and no more lawsuits in that field, but also that it saves businesses, their brands and their employees, their very existence. And so I think, I sorry for taking up so much time of that, but I think it's really important to sort of understand that, we as food safety advocates, both people in industry, government, and consumer groups, we can accomplish things. And I think that's what has driven me to do things like, I petitioned the US government to expand the definition of adulterants to include other forms of Shiga toxin producing E. coli, and that was successful. I've petitioned the US government to consider salmonella as an adulterant. That's still not where I want it to be, but they're making progress.
Yeah.
I pushed very hard for the Food Safety Modernization Act, and we could talk about some of the crazy things I did about handing out T-shirts back in 2009 that said, put a trial lawyer out of business, pass food safety legislation by Christmas. And so, I just think that we never know. We never know what we might do that might change people's hearts and minds. That's the funny thing about human progress, I think. And so I give that to you in context, Brian, that, so what am I doing now with the FDA? So, and I'm back on the road now, giving speeches. I was in Minnesota a couple of weeks ago, and then Ohio, and then this week in Utah. Next week I'm in Ontario, and then Salinas, and then Canada again, and so then the food safety conference, food safety summit. So I back kind of doing what I do in addition to all the other legal stuff I do on the side. But I've always been a big supporter of public health, CDC, FDA. I've spoken at God knows how many conferences and worked with them on a bunch of different projects. But I think the infant formula, and I'll just call it what it is, a fiasco, sort of just pushed me over the edge a little bit. And, people can argue about, whether there really was an outbreak, and I think those are really paying attention. You have, 4 children, 2 who died. all with Coronabacter, which I will note is only real reportable disease in 2 states. So we don't really know the scope of the outbreak.
Hmm.
And those 4 kids all had different strains of Coronabacter. And none of those strains were found in infant formula or in the Sturgis plant.
Oh,
So, there's a scientific argument, one way that you could say, wow, these things aren't related. Um, there's an epidemiological argument that, the common denominator between these kids was that they were all eating infant formula. And apparently my understanding was that was their sole source of nutrition. So, it's one of those sort of things epidemiologically is, not necessarily having that smoking gun of a positive test, but it's really what's the most likely thing to have occurred. But, setting that aside, that prompted, a deeper dive into the Sturgis plant. But what it did uncover was that the FDA hadn't been there in a year,
mhm.
which is kind of amazing for an infant formula factory, even during COVID. I have to admit that I get it. We want to protect our people, but on the other hand, this is an infant formula plant. And then, if you look at the 483s, their inspection report, and you look at the consent decree that they, essentially assented that they were producing food under insanitary conditions. And then, what happened to the whistleblower report that came, months earlier that sort of never saw the light of day because of one excuse or another. And then they shut the plant down, and then it caused an infant formula crisis that I think most people should have been paying it, in government should have been paying attention to.
Yeah.
And I think that just undercuts the government's credibility, and boy, the feedback I was getting both from people inside the FDA, people outside the FDA, former FDA people, industry people. It's like, you know, um, what happened and why. And I probably know more about the inner workings of the FDA than most people. But if you ask me, like, what happened and who was responsible and who should be held accountable for that, I couldn't tell you. And the reason why is that if you ever look, the people on the line should Google FDA organizational chart 2013 and
Uh-huh.
just look at that thing and just say, gee, I wonder why you can't figure out who's responsible, because it's a the org chart is a mess. And so I started talking to a lot of smart people, and because I'm a lawyer, I've been around a long time, but there are a lot of people who are clearly way smarter than I am when it comes to food safety and organizations and things like that. But it just really kind of coalesced to me that there was a real problem with the structure of the FDA.
Mhm.
And to Commissioner Califf's credit, he asked the Reagan-Udall Foundation to look at the infant formula crisis, in not necessarily to make a decision about how it happened, because they wanted to do that internally. And those who've read that report, it's a non-report.
Yeah, I've read it.
He asked the Reagan-Udall Foundation, to take a look at how FDA was structured and give, you know, recommendations. And surprisingly, they invited some 30, 40 people to testify. Each person had 5 minutes, and surprisingly, they invited me to come talk. And so I flew to DC from Seattle. People came from all over the country, all different backgrounds. Lots of people from inside the FDA. A lot of people, in consumer groups and people who know the space. And because I was there, I stayed the full 2 days and watched the entire hearings. And I was just really impressed with the quality of the people who testified. I was really impressed by the people on the Reagan-Udall panel. And I was also stunned by the uniformity of the consensus between all of these people that the FDA needed to be restructured.
Mm.
That the F of the FDA was really sort of the red-haired stepchild, both from a food safety point of view, but also I learned a lot about, the failures with human nutrition and just how large of a problem human nutrition, obesity, heart disease, diabetes, cancers caused by, the food we consume, is a problem and a huge economic problem. But it's clear from this group that the drug side of the FDA, primarily because, nearly every commissioner who comes from the FDA comes from some drug background, and who could
Right.
historically that's the case, and that there's really a lack of clear authority in having someone on the food side with direct control over the levers within the FDA, CISFAN, ORA, et cetera, the vet folks, really with the human food supply. And the consensus really is that, and there were different degrees on how one should do that, but there was definitely a consensus that we needed a different structure where everything food was under one person, and that one person had a background in food safety and human nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
And I took the position that there should be two commissioners, one for food and human nutrition and one for drugs and medical devices, and then reorg FDA to fit that. And then both of those individuals were direct reports to Health and Human Service Secretary, a member of the cabinet. Essentially, using the example of essentially how FSIS is organized over at USDA. Mm-hmm. And I don't necessarily agree with everything, FSIS does. I get in little tits with them all the time, but at least I know who the hell's in charge.
Yeah.
And FDA, you just don't know. And mm-hmm. so from that, I was hopeful that they would do something, and it was pretty clear, despite, what, Dr. Califf says and the press releases, they're not doing anything, really. They're right. Not fixing the problem. And so from that, I was like, they basically brought all these stakeholders in and ignored them. And I just find that, it's not me, per se. I got to come to DC, which is one of my favorite cities in the world. I got to see my oldest daughter who lives there. So it wasn't like a terrible situation for me, but I was just like, good God, if you're going to ask people for advice, freaking take it.
Yeah.
And so then that's what prompted me to start thinking about, maybe I should do something. And I started coming up with different things to do. And I remembered my T-shirts from, the Food Safety Modernization Act. And I was thinking about it. Finally, I came up with this because I had originally drafted, put the food back into FDA. And I meant that we needed to focus more on it.
Yeah.
And I started thinking about it, and I came up with this twist: get the F out of the FDA, which is a little obviously, meant to shock a little bit. And then I came up with these T-shirts, mm-hmm. And so I made 250. I had 250 of them made, and I know I'm just rambling along, but you asked, so yeah. Then I was like, I wanted to get them to Congress members and senators, and just sort of the way things are nowadays, you have to be kind of obviously careful about how you do that. And the last time I did it, I had each shirt put into an individual plastic sleeve. And this time I wanted to do the same thing so they could be handed out. And the guy who was making my t-shirt says, I could put them in any container. We could put them in and then shrink wrap them. And I'm like, really? So I gave him a head of romaine lettuce, and I said, can you put it in something that looks like this? So I have one around the house here somewhere, but it's basically a hand-sized head of romaine lettuce that says, get the F out of the FDA. So we have handed out essentially 300 of them to Congress members and senators.
Mm-hmm.
And then I originally said on a blog post that I'd give out 100 of them to the first people who emailed me. But my email blew up and I had like 300 people the first day. And so I ordered more, and we have now ordered over 1,000.
Wow.
And and there are people from all over the world. I mean, I have mailed these to South Africa, to the EU, to China, to Australia, and then a lot of people inside the FDA asking me to mail them to their home addresses.
Can I get one of those? Yeah.
And I was just at a conference just a few days ago, and people were like, "Oh, I want one." So, who knows where this is going to go? We did an advertising campaign in all the Hill newspapers. Candidly, I spent $50,000 on advertising to get the word out, and have gotten a lot of feedback from Congress members and senators about potential restructure of the FDA. So anyway, that's what and people, I think legitimately there's arguments about how things should be restructured or why, and should there be one food safety agency that encompasses both FSIS and the food side of FDA. There's been lots of discussions about that for hell as long as I've been doing this kind of work. But I think what this underscores is I think there is a desire for industry and for consumers to know who in the hell is responsible on the FDA side of the equation. Yeah. And so there's a much more clearer understanding of the rules, and that the rules are rational and make sense and are not unduly burdensome on industry, that they can meet those requirements, that it takes into account the size of the company and the realities of the situation. But, we have not moved, other than sort of shifting 0157 problems from hamburger to leafy greens, we haven't shifted the numbers at all in 30 years. We haven't, our numbers on salmonella and Campylobacter per 100,000 are as bad as they were in the 90s.
Yeah.
And then you roll out on top of that, the obesity problems, and which the heart disease and cancers and diabetes, which is incredibly expensive. And the thing, I have a tendency to be more emotional about the injuries to these people, whether it be from human nutrition or for food poisoning, and just the absolute cost of that. But if you think about it from a taxpayer point of view, where we ultimately are responsible for this through Medicare, but also through our health insurance, and also through our local taxes, when people who don't have insurance, who go to an ER, and we have to pay for it that way. So we all pay for this. It's just like, why don't we figure out a way to solve the problem So if people don't get hurt, people don't get sick, people are healthier, and we spend less money, which, is kind of a big deal. And
Yeah.
I don't know how to do that, to be honest with you, brother. It's frustrating, but I feel like I'm trying to do my little part, and I think that's kind of what we all, need to do, is do our little part.
Yeah.
And because we don't know if at one point the stars align and our little part moves something like E. coli 015787 in hamburger becoming an adulterant, which moved like an industry. I'm just hopeful that we don't necessarily have to have a crisis like a Jack in the Box that prompts us to do that. Although, knowing as much about human nature as I do, I don't know. So
Yeah, I
anyway,
agree.
so
Yeah.
sorry for taking up all this time.
Oh, no. This is
You asked the question, so
no, this is great. And so I think part of it, yeah, and Austin had a really good comment here. Poor management of the F in FDA leads to higher revenue for D. Yeah, exactly.
that's a dang good. That's a really, really, really good point. I mean, think about um, there's several of these anti-diabetic drugs that apparently also have some, effect of reducing weight.
Yeah.
And there's this absolutely crazy run on it. I mean, that apparently nobody could get it, and like everybody in Hollywood is buying it to fit into their gowns for the Oscars or whatever. But
Yeah.
I mean, you think about and I think, what's the guy's name that made that comment? But yeah, I mean, it's completely apt. I mean, we create these problems, and then we create a solution to the problem
Without addressing.
instead of going and fixing the original problem.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, to your point too, Bill. I mean, it's human nature, right? It's like, somebody calls me up and, says, hey, we're doing a survey on, healthy attributes and what people are doing. Okay, Mr. Armentrout, do you exercise 5 days a week? Oh, absolutely, 100%. Do you eat only healthy food? Completely. How about your alcohol consumption? Oh, geez, a small glass of wine a week. Bullshit. It's all bullshit. Right? I don't do that. I'm terrible, right? But nobody wants to admit these things, and that's part of the problem too. And a friend of mine, there was a funny. So on Austin's comment, I thought of one as well too. There's no fat 90-year-olds, right? They're all dead. They don't make it that far, right? And so when you see these 90, 100-year-old, centenarians who make it that far, right? They're all, kind of the same body type, right? They've gotten in the habit of taking care of themselves, and they have good genetics and these type of things. Right. But still, right? It all kind of gets back to the behavioral side. Around FDA as well too. I mean, FDA, it's people. And one of the things that I always taught my quality managers and things in plants as they're preparing documentation and writing procedures and things like this is, if you write a procedure that has two people who are responsible for something, nobody is. Because if I go and ask who was at fault, they're both going to point at each other. And, that's just kind of human nature. There's a friend of mine who used to work inside FDA and said, a lot of it too is, we kind of view, when new people come in and have an initiative as the flavor of the month. And, if we can just wait it out, they'll get frustrated and leave, and everything goes back to normal, right?
Right.
That's just kind of human nature. And part of it, and you see this in the private sector too, Bill, is, as companies evolve and grow and get larger and larger and larger, bureaucracy sets in, and procedures are written, and things just tend to cement into those positions, and it's really, really hard to move them. But to your point earlier, I think, and this is something we talk about on the chat every now and then, is, people like to think that change kind of happens on a gradual slope, and that's definitely not the case, right? There's a major issue that occurs, right, and then all of a sudden people get pissed off and upset about it, and then you go up to that kind of that next level. we saw that with FSMA, right? People were,
Right.
The melamine in the dog food and, these type of things. And it hit people at home and they were like, oh my God, my poor dog got sick and
Right.
died.
Yeah,
And
I think people were more concerned about that than anything else. But
yeah,
you know, but you know the you know, so I was involved very early with FISBA, and I agreed that it wasn't like a particular crisis. It was just sort of so many of them coming at the melamine in the dog food. Hey, hon, how are you? Say hi. You just made it on. That was my lovely wife. So, in any event, but it was like the melamine in the dog food, it was the spinach E. coli outbreak, it was the PCA, it was
oh yeah,
bomb, bomb, bomb. But it also had to do with the fact that many of the proposals that went into the Food Safety Modernization Act were things that were discussed after the Jack in the Box outbreak. I mean,
mm,
many of what became the Senate or House version of the at FSMA were things that were essentially on the shelves and that were shelved in 1996 when Newt Gingrich took over the House.
mm-hmm.
And so we didn't see the light of day for a decade on
Huh.
food safety legislation. So I tell that story not because I'm, Republican or a Democrat, but, votes matter, who's in positions of power matter, and who's, pushing the legislation matters. And it really became, once the House split back and the Senate was both Democratic, those proposals from the 90s, which were Democratic proposals, came forward. But you had to also have these crises, and you had consumers. I mean, I flew, little known fact during from 2006 to 2009. I probably on my own nickel sent 45 to 50 of my clients to DC to testify
Mm.
and walk the halls of Congress. So, you never know how it's going to happen, but, it's just really a matter of, don't give up, don't give up, don't give in. So,
Huh. I mean, it's, and I think this is kind of what's interesting now as well is things have really changed now with things like this, like what we're doing on here, the availability of information on Twitter and all these type of things. iwaspoisoned.com, right, where there's more visibility around these
right.
things. Because I think a lot of it too, Bill, kind of goes back to, oh, that's not going to happen to me, right? Until it does, and that's something that is a huge warning sign for me when I'm looking at auditing other locations or even within my own company. If someone would say to me, "Oh, we've never had a problem before," right? That's a huge warning
Right.
signal right there that a problem is just around the corner because people just have this assumption that whatever occurred in the past is somehow magically going to continue in the future. It's kind of that syndrome, right? When you see people, there's a caught by the side of the road or there's a fender bender, everybody always slows up. And that only lasts
Right.
for about a block, and then you're back to it. Part of that too, right? I was thinking about this as we were prepping for this call. Is a lot of this, continuing the automobile analogy, is you've heard in the past, safety features are great and these type of things, but does that actually encourage bad driving behavior? Because it's like, oh yeah, I've got airbags and everything else protecting me, and I've got auto insurance and it's all good. Got to wonder if recall insurance and things like this in companies, helps to insulate them and saying, well, yeah, we got a little bit of a problem, but we've got 10 million in recall insurance. We'll be fine. We just need to provide that due diligence and then we're cool. So I was just kind of curious about your opinion on that.
Yeah. I mean, I've thought about less from a recall insurance point of view, but from a, of the $850 million I've taken from the food industry on behalf of my clients over the last 30 years, 825 million of that has come from an insurance policy somewhere.
Mm.
So, there have been some cases where, I've bankrupted companies and picked over their remains. That doesn't happen that often. And, there is, I think, the argument that because the companies themselves don't feel the pain other than their insurance premiums, and there really is not necessarily a direct relationship between claims and higher premiums. That's a sort of a bugaboo that the industry says to figure out ways to put clamps on lawyers suing because what's happening is the insurance companies are paying the bill.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, but I think that especially companies that care about their brands, these outbreaks have more, maybe don't have the economic thing that happens to companies, but it's the brand, it's the sales, that's the stuff that they really want to avoid.
Yeah.
And, and frankly, that's why, I came to the conclusion relatively early in my career that taking money from insurance companies wasn't going to be enough to change companies' behaviors. What you really had to do was make them understand what it was that was the grief. And I'll give you an example. A lot of people, understandably, criticize me for, being in the press talking about these cases and stuff, and I get that. But the reason why I do that is because the people who are reading that is not just me and it's not just you. It's the CEO of the company. It's his or her buddies in the whatever club they are. And I remember this one CEO of a significant company who the company had an outbreak, and I got one of my clients on the front page of the newspaper, and the lawyer for that CEO, lawyer for that company, told me that when the settlement happened, that one of the biggest reasons why the settlement happened was one day that CEO went into his golf and country club, and everybody had the newspaper with the person on the front page, and they all were reading it when the guy walks into the locker room.
Good.
Yes. No. And I mean, yeah. I think that's a lot of times where people just don't want to come to grips with what has happened. And so the economics of it is one thing, but it really becomes, in my view, the company. It's kind of, we've talked about this before and other times. It's just talk about the food safety culture of the company. Is it the economics aside? Is food safety, is human nutrition, is producing a safe product the thing that drives your engine, or is it something else? Right. And that's that's the thing that we got to keep pushing on, government and industry, and the people that support government and industry to do the right thing. So,
yeah. Well, and I think, right, the central theme on that, right, is that it's our nature as human beings to conceptualize and move things into the abstract. But these are people, right? And that's why I think Darren Detweiler is so effective, in sharing his burden and putting a face and saying, this is my son, Riley. He died because of this, right? He was robbed of his entire life. And putting that faith out there. No, this is not statistics. These are people.
Right.
And that's one of the things I would always train my quality managers on is I need to know in your production facility, if you can't go out to that production line right now, pull anything off of that line and take it home and feed it to your granddaughter, I want to know.
Right.
And building that in and making sure the companies understand that, because it's so easy to pull back and not make those connections and not see what you're seeing every day and view it as a job. To your point, no, this is not a job. We're feeding America, and we're that trust and those bonds. Once you break those, oh my God, right? And so, and that's one of the reasons why, to your point, I do things like this chat on Fridays and things like this is to bring more of that awareness, because the general public, they have no idea, what's going on with these type of things. They just assume everything is fine. It reminds me when I like most people who work in the food industry and work in quality assurance and food safety and things like this, I fell into it. And one time I was talking with my mom, and my mom loved coffee. And so I was trying to explain to her what I did. I'm kind of getting that mom look on her face, like, yeah. So I said, okay, let me explain this, Mom. I'm like, you love your coffee. And she's like, oh my God, yes. Okay. There's a certain flavor and aroma, and you bring it up and it's got that smell, and your cream billows into the cup when you pour it in, and you taste it, and it's just the right amount of bitterness, and it's got that slight chocolate note. And she's like, yes. I'm like, that's quality. And that's what I'm here to make sure that continues in the product, so you always get what you expect. And she's like, oh, okay. And I said, and the second thing I do is to make sure that cup of coffee, when you drink it, doesn't kill you. And she was like, oh. I'm like, yeah. And
that's important too.
She got it. And so she understood. And that's how I've explained it from that point forward to anybody who asks, because getting that information out in front of the public is really important. And especially when you have these rogue companies, like that ice cream company in Florida, who had a major issue and refused to admit responsibility, even if they did anything wrong. Those guys need to be absolutely pilloried when those type of things happen. They need to be made.
Oh, they were.
Yeah.
You can count on that. I get that.
Because those piss me off, because that just impacts everybody else in the industry, because then we get labeled and drugged down in the mud with their mess. One of the things I'm curious, and this is something too, Bill, that I talk about here on the chat every now and then, is visibility. I mean, part of the problem as a food safety person is something big happens in the industry, and I see it in the reports, I read it in food safety news, and I go, oh crap. And I want to know what happened. Why did it happen, and what did the company do to fix it? And that second part is always hidden, right? The companies want to make this all go away.
Right.
And the analogy I've used on here before is the National Transportation Safety Board. So when a terrible incident happens with, Kobe Bryant's helicopter or something like this, there's a giant investigation. It's extremely public, and we get to find out, 6 months or a year later, what the heck went wrong and what was done to correct those mistakes moving forward. And as a result of that, in the airline industry, right, super safe. None of us worries about getting on an airplane. Why can't we do something like that in the food industry? What's holding us back on that?
Well, I think it's because things aren't as transparent as they should be, and it's it's different at the FAA, and it's different at USDA and FDA. Things aren't transparent like that. I mean, if you get an inspection report from the FDA or from FSIS, it's sometimes completely redacted.
Yeah.
Like it's some kind of secret weapon, it's like secret document. And, I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. So the transparency needed is voluntary. Transparency of companies is voluntary, and there aren't that many companies that are confident enough to be transparent. The Jack in the Box outbreak was transparent about what they were doing and why they were doing it, and that changed, in my view, the beef industry for the better. But think about sprout outbreaks. Think about leafy green outbreaks. I mean, sometimes the only transparency is through the courtrooms, and the disclosures that I make. I got a lot of grief back in post 2018 when the FDA put out their chart of the outbreak, and they had, growers A through Z, and then processors, 1, 2, and 4, and then points of service, A through J. Well, because of litigation, I knew who the points of service were, because there were clusters of cases at, restaurant, this one, this one, and this one. And I sued those restaurants. I flipped them who their suppliers were. Then I named them, and then I worked my way all the way back upstream. Public never saw any of that.
Yeah.
Any of that. They didn't know that there were clusters of cases, at some of the leading restaurants in the country, and that they, what was their level of interest or responsibility to make sure that the leafy greens that they were getting to make their Caesar salads, weren't grown within a stone's throw of 100,000 cow feedlot in Yuma, Arizona. I think there's a failure of transparency, because, so much of the rules within FSIS and FDA cover those up through, these sorts of agreements with the industry. And I just don't. I think in the long run, it doesn't serve us well at all.
No, absolutely not. Yeah. So, I mean, if
short,
we're going to
short run, the companies don't get their name in the newspaper, or on TV or whatever. But, in the long run, it doesn't give anybody any incentive to change anything. So,
no, yeah, I mean, because if an issue happens in a food company, their main reaction in most cases is going to be protect the brand, right?
Right.
That's our objective. And it's not take care of the consumer. It's not make sure we're not making anybody else ill. It's protect the brand.
Right. And I think, but the government's not going to solve these problems totally.
No.
But I think what government can do is set a standard that people have to play by. And I think they have to be science-based and, market-based. They need to be thoughtful. I get it, and, that sort of the one-size-fits-all doesn't work and all that kind of stuff. And government, and, nobody likes to be told what to do. I mean, shit, I didn't like to be told what I was to do when I was 2. I really don't like to be told what I'm doing at 65. So, so I get all that. But the fact of the matter is we live in a complex world, complex society, and to think that we don't need to have, rules and regulations that level the playing field, that, incentivize people to do the right thing. People are still going to screw stuff up. People are still going to make bad decisions. You're still going to have people, like Stuart Parnell and PCA knowingly shipping salmonella tainted product. You're going to have that, and they need to be held accountable. But I just keep going back to Mike Taylor, September 1994, stood in front of the American Meat Institute and said, "From here on out, E. coli 0157 is an adulterant." Boom.
Uh-huh.
That changed. That I don't mean to over dramatize it, but not only did it take tens of millions of dollars out of my pocket, but it saved thousands of lives of little kids.
Yeah.
Isn't that what government's job is? I mean, for God's sakes.
Yeah.
I look at that and I just think that there's so many opportunities for government and industry to do exactly that same thing in a thoughtful, meaningful way. But we have such a hard time wrapping our head around the things that we aren't positive are going to happen. Which I think is it's kind of a weird I've thought about this a lot. It's kind of a weird evolutionary thing. It's like, if you assume that our faraway ancestors were in trees before they jumped down on the savannah, you would kind of think that those people who jumped out of the trees, were probably folks who were better at like figuring out whether or not a leopard or a lion was around the corner or hiding in a bush. And you'd
Uh-huh.
think that that would have like sunk down into our DNA, but it just doesn't seem like we're very good at looking around the corner.
Hmm.
And like, this is where my frenemy Frank Giannis and I teach a class with Frank at MSU, and it's coming up here in a couple months. This is where Frank and I, the kind of idea of food safety culture, kind of keeps kind of connecting. It's the ability to have people paying attention. The people in the tree, before they jump out, they go, "Hey, there's a bad thing around that bush. Let's not. We gotta. Don't jump out of the tree." And so I just think that we just need to figure out ways to all of us to be a little bit more like the guy in the tree before they jump out of the tree.
Right. I like that. I like that analogy. It's good. We're getting some really good back and forth here in the comments. So yeah, interesting discussion. Thanks, Brian. So definitely, yeah. So we're getting some back and forth here on the NTSB analogy and these type of things. And so part of it here too is right. It's why does the media bring things to people's attention? They're not doing it altruistically. They're say, okay, what's going to get the most clicks? We all see this in the media. It's like so and so destroys, and then they want you to click on the link, and it's not even what they advertise. So the point made in the comment there was, large scale, the Kobe Bryant example, right? Famous celebrity dies in crash. It's going to get attention. The poor little girl who's sick in the hospital because she may have eaten something. Yeah, that's not going to get the headline. And that needs to change, right? So how can, figuring out ways to bring this to people's attention. And to your point, emerging risks, right? The guy in the tree. So for me, you have your list of food you won't eat. And one of those on your newsletter that I see all the time is enoki mushrooms, right? It's just like, oh my God, it's like another recall for listeria and enoki mushrooms. I'm paying attention. So I'm like, there's no way in hell I'm ever going to eat enoki mushrooms. But the average person, no clue, right? No clue
Right.
that this is a potential risk. They just assume it's okay.
Right. Right. Yeah. No. I mean, and and the other thing too, Brian, is that even when you feel like you kind of like got like something tamped down, like
Mhm.
some weird like human behavior pops up. Like I had this is probably 10 years ago. There was a cluster, kind of an oddity. There was a cluster of E. coli cases linked to a restaurant, and linked to hamburger. And you know what the name of the restaurant was? Bar 145. It was a bar that prided itself in cooking hamburgers to less than the food code standard. That was, and guess what? They had an outbreak. Well, part of it was that they were like, oh, there hasn't been an E. coli outbreak linked to hamburger for such a long time. Let's eat it rare. I mean, I still get asked when I go to a restaurant, how I want my hamburger. I'm like, I want it to 155. They're like, what? If they, my friend Ben Chapman from North Carolina
Mhm.
State University, if you haven't had him on, you should. But he has this great thing. It's like, if they don't have, if they kind of look at me like, what? I'll order something else. So
That's definitely smart. So this just kind of popped in my head as well too. So we've been talking a lot kind of the industry reaction and these type of things. What's been your take on inside FDA as you've been talking about these things and talking with different individuals in the organization? What do they think? Are they like, no, everything's fine? I mean, what is the kind of the average guy working
no,
on?
no. I think people, depends on the level.
Yeah.
I think people at the top, at the FDA, are certainly not going to send me any Christmas cards. But I think people farther down the chain,
Mhm.
absolutely get it, especially on the food side. And yeah, they're maybe the heads of some of the their silos, want to keep their power,
Right.
and I get that. And hey, changing organization structures. Hey, I have a firm of 30 people, tweaking even my little firm, the organization structure is difficult.
Yeah.
So
yeah, people don't like change. That's for
no.
sure. And then, so I mean, to your point with Congress, then as well. I mean, so Durbin and Delora, we hear kind of the same voices every time. Are you getting any other traction with other members of Congress who have been kind of picking this up?
Yeah, actually, for slightly different reasons, but I guess, whatever the reason sometimes. But, there have been some Republican Congress members and senators who've been paying attention to this, primarily, as a cudgel against, the
Mhm.
Democrats for not being better at, the food safety issue regarding infant formula as a political issue. But kind of
Mhm.
the way I look at it is, you know, whatever gets them to ask tough questions. And if you look at some of the hearings that the oversight committee had recently with Frank Yanis testifying and the commissioner testifying, I mean, they there were some pretty pointed questions. I mean, but it's still going to take time. It's I think it's still going to take time. Even the people who, the Rosa Dolores and the Durbins and those folks in the world, they've got a lot of other stuff on their plate.
Mhm.
Um, and, they have to balance all of that. And, I think, we can't wait for them to fix it. We've got to keep pushing our own little things that we can do as much as we can do to fix things. And I think, um, you know, I just keep trying. I mean, uh, the Netflix documentary about the book Poison is going to come out in June,
Yeah.
and I've seen the whole cut. And there's a line at the very end. Um, it's like, what are you going to do? And I'm like, I'm going to get back to work.
Mhm.
And I think that's the best that we can do. And I think we just keep getting back to work, doing what we do, making connections, trying, kind of keep pushing. Um, there's I urge you and your listeners, watchers. There's a there's a great video of hero of mine, Bruce Lee, the
Oh yeah.
kung fu guy. There's a great, like, you Google "Be Like Water,"
Mhm.
and there's a video of him in his own egomaniacal way of explaining how he to be like water, to and I think that's what I think we all need to do with respect to food safety. We always need to be searching for the way to break through, because that's what water does.
Yeah.
It's sometimes hard, sometimes steamy, sometimes, but it's always trying to find a way through the crack. And to
Right.
me, that crack is, you know, sort of human desire to not do something. And you just got to keep sort of pushing in a different way, in a different ways. And I think, Bruce Lee's right, be like water, my friend. So,
Yeah, I agree. So to kind of close out our conversation here today, so for people who are listening, what recommendations on how they can help? I mean, you've been fighting this battle, and there's lots of people who want to help, me included. What can we do to help you?
well, I think being aware of, who the politicians, on the oversight committee, the help committee for the Senate, the oversight committee, FDA oversight committee in the House, it's not very difficult to find out who they are, and write them a note, write them a note. Just say, hey, I'm so and so. I'm a food safety professional, or this has happened to me. I think that you should do something. And I just think that um, you know, you never know when it's going to happen. I think doing your little part is a good thing. If if people on your call are going to be at the Food Safety Summit coming up soon in Chicago, stop by the Food Safety News booth and grab a T-shirt and or two, and so and wear it proudly.
Yeah, definitely. Amazing conversation. These comments here have been great, guys. Thank you very much for this participation. I think, just the volume of comments we have here, Bill, really shows, people are interested in this, or people are willing to support. And I know that a lot of times in food safety, we feel that we're on our own, right? We're in a company, right, and we're fighting this battle. And so that's where this comes through too, is you're not alone, right? We all care about this. We want to have safe food for everyone, and that's important. And I kind of went on my normal routine here for today, because normally at the beginning, we'll drink a toast with our cup of coffee. But today, I wanted to raise my glass to you, Bill.
Thanks. Here's to you. It's empty now, but I'm going to fill it up again. So it's still a little early for me. So I got to get to work. I can't believe it's Friday already.
Yeah, it's crazy. Fantastic conversation. Thank you, everybody, for the participation. As everybody knows, Bill's a super busy guy. Taking time early in the morning, getting in the way of his wife's breakfast, and taking the time here to talk with us. Greatly appreciate it. Everybody, please enjoy your weekend, and we will see you back here for the next Food Safety Chat on Friday at the same time. So 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 a.m. Eastern, or early in the morning at 7 a.m. if you're on the West Coast. So everybody have a great weekend, and we will see you back here next week. And thanks again, Bill. Have a great one.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Take care. Good to see you. See you again.
Same here. Bye.